start off with an acknowledgement of country. So I would like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting tonight on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And so for those of you who are watching with vision impairment, I am a tall white woman in my 40s with greying blonde hair, let's be honest, and I'm wearing a pale blue shirt. So as Patricia mentioned, my role at IWDA involves leading and managing strategic research projects for the organisation, including this one, which I implemented with my colleague Alice and our team leader, Joanna Pradella. And so I just wanted to quickly give an overview of, there we go. So the format of our panel tonight, the way that we'll share our presentation is that I'm going to start off by giving a brief overview of the research background and the research design. And then I'll throw to Alice, who will share our key findings in 2 chunks. And after each section of findings that she presents, we'll be having some discussion with Daniela and Neha about why they think the research findings are important and the significance of the findings for regional and global advocacy from their perspectives. So first of all, we like to start off, our presentations on feminist foreign policy with a definition. There is no sort of one clear established global definition or benchmark for feminist foreign policy. But the one that IWDA used that was developed with the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition is the one that we have up on the slide here. So feminist foreign policy is a framework to understand and transform the global systems of power which uphold and perpetuate inequality, including patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, racism, and others, in order to create peaceful and flourishing societies. So in terms of the research and how it came about, so IWDA has been working for 7 years now to advance understandings and work on feminist foreign policy in collaboration with women's rights organisations around the world through research, through advocacy, and through other strategic collaborations. In 2019, a presentation on our work at the Australasian Aid Conference led to a question about the pathways that countries who had declared feminist foreign policies in 2019, what pathways had those countries taken to get their feminist foreign policies in place? And what were the key factors that had enabled those commitments to be made and had undermined the process of declaration? So in response in 2020, we thought, okay, well, let's look into this properly. So we did a literature review and we designed a qualitative research project to answer this question more fully. The output of that was the From Seeds to Roots research report with the purple cover there, which examined the pathways taken by 4 of the early feminist foreign policy adopters. So Canada, Sweden, Mexico, and France, and really sort of examined in depth what are some of the common key factors that the 4 countries experienced that got those declarations over the line. In response to the findings of the research, particularly about the role of civil society in creating an enabling environment for declarations to be made, IWDA established the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, which is still running. So we established the Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition. So also, in addition to how our work led to this moment, since 2021, when we last looked at this issue, the feminist foreign policy landscape has changed quite dramatically. So there are now 15 governments who have at some point formally declared a feminist foreign policy, 10 more than at the time of our previous research project. Sweden, the first country to declare a feminist foreign policy, has now dropped their commitment, as have the Netherlands and Argentina. And nearly half of all FFP commitments have now been made by majority world countries. And in addition, recent geopolitical events such as the COVID-19 crisis, Israel's war on Gaza, Russia's invasion of Ukraine it really informed the critical debates and questions about the scope of feminist foreign policy, the shape and the implementation. So it's also worth noting that since 2021, several countries, including Australia, have made other value-based commitments to foreign policy. So in 2021, Aotearoa, New Zealand's first Maori foreign minister, Nanaia Mauta, gave a speech outlining the Maori worldviews and values that would guide her foreign policy. And in 2022, our own Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, committed to a First Nations approach to foreign policy. So as we approached a decade of feminist foreign policy, The purpose of this research project was to really try and update what we know about how and why the declarations come about and the factors that make these declarations possible, and whether or how these factors have changed over time. Are they still the same with the newer declarations, or have they changed as to sort of reflect the changes in the political landscape? So in terms of how we answer this question, IWDA has a decolonial and feminist research framework that guides all of our research projects. So in line with that, we adopted a qualitative methodology and research activities that were feminist, accountable, collaborative, and designed to contribute towards transformational change. We also had a key question to guide our research, which was, what are the factors and conditions that have enabled the declaration, development, and institutionalisation of feminist foreign policies? So similar question to last time when we looked at this issue. Alice and I, between us, we conducted 24 interviews between October 2023 and February 2024 with participants from 14 countries, and you can see the detail of who we spoke to on the slide. I think it's important to note that some of the participants that we interviewed this time were also participants in our first research projects. They were follow-up interviews about changes that have happened with the feminist foreign policies in certain countries over the last 3 years. But other people that we interviewed were new participants, especially as it relates to some of the countries that have more recently declared their feminist foreign policies. We identified prospective participants through our literature review, through our networks, through the meetings that we're attending, and also through the other participants that we were speaking with as well. So next stage was data analysis. This was thematic, participatory, and involved multiple stages, which was intentional because we wanted to get as much feedback on the findings as we could to sort of strengthen and validate the overall picture that came out of the research. So IWDA, we first worked together in our team to generate an early analysis of the key findings and recommendations. We then tested these findings and recommendations with 11 research participants who came from government, civil society, and academia to see what they thought of the research findings. Did they resonate? Do they fit with their understanding? And what do they think is significant to come out of the research? And then further feedback was received from participants at 3 international convenings that were held in Mexico City between June and July. So a couple of limitations to note as well. We were unable to reach participants with distinct knowledge of the feminist foreign policy commitments in Liberia, Luxembourg, and Libya. And we were able to reach limited representatives from Germany, Spain, and Slovenia. So we spoke with either government or civil society for those countries, but not both. Also, as this research is focused very much on the policy development declaration and those trajectories, but isn't an assessment of implementation, our participants were from those countries that have made feminist foreign policy commitments, but were not generally people who are affected by feminist foreign policy commitments. So that's knowledge that, you know, further research is definitely warranted to sort of explore that issue of implementation effectiveness further. So now I'll hand over to Alice to go through the findings.
Thank you. So do you mind doing the clicker as well?
Yes.
Thank you. So as Liz mentioned, we were updating research we did previously in 2021. And so we were looking very much at what had changed since that early wave of adoptions of feminist foreign policy. And in 2021, we identified 5 key factors in the declaration of feminist foreign policies. And importantly, that's just the declaration, just the political statement or commitment, not the policy process, which is what comes next. So what we found in 2021, there were 5 key factors in declaration of feminist foreign policies, which were that they came as a surprise. So there was often no warning to civil society or even sometimes to other colleagues within government that a minister was going to come out and say, we now have a feminist foreign policy. But that they did obviously come from a values-aligned political leader, and not just in terms of their political party or their sort of professional life, but also their personal values and what they'd done in previous roles. They were often responding to the need for some kind of announceable. So the Me Too movement was a really big force in the adoption of feminist foreign policies. Often these governments were looking for gender policies to announce because they had some scandals going on. and or they had some kind of opportunity on the world stage. So they wanted to stand out. They wanted to be kind of a global leader, get people talking, be the global feminist leader. So in France and Canada, they were both hosting the G7 when they announced their policies. Mexico was hosting the Generation Equality Forum. So these kind of world stage moments. And, you know, that's a mix of kind of values and pragmatic drivers. But what we really found was all of that was enabled by long-term advocacy by feminist civil society. So while they weren't necessarily calling for feminist foreign policy in those words, they were calling for feminist approaches to policy in general. What we found this time is that the element of surprise and the imperative to stand out on the world stage aren't really key factors anymore. So now that there are more countries with this approach, countries are using it as a way to signal alignment of their values with other countries. Sometimes that was regional. So particularly in Latin America, we're starting to see kind of a growth in feminist foreign policy commitments across the region who are really defining that in new ways. So Colombia has identified pacifism as one of the core principles of their FFP. In Chile, we see a focus on economic justice. So really sort of different emphasis than what we've seen from particularly European and North American commitments. But the alignment, the values alignment of leaders remains really important, as in some cases does the pragmatic need for an announceable. And the role of civil society in creating an enabling environment was really affirmed, with this sort of new element or new theme emerging more strongly this time, which was about the interplay between feminist insiders within government and outsiders in civil society. So in this new context, what we're seeing is actors within government increasingly framing feminist foreign policy as kind of a new way of articulating existing values and commitments, which could prove to be an effective strategy for building support amongst governments for taking this approach, really grounding it in, you know, these are the kinds of values that we've always supported. And really what we found is that FFP as a label has really moved from being a fringe idea to something that's now really part of the mainstream discourse. I was in Bangkok last week, and we had a side event on feminist foreign policy, and we had, you know, the head of the civil society division of UN Women, Lurpa Banerjee, speaking about the importance of feminist foreign policy. We had a speaker from the ambassador of Mongolia to the UN in Bangkok, speaking about what their government is doing. And so really sort of seeing this taken much more seriously. You know, I think it's the first time we'd had feminist foreign policy on the agenda of a UN meeting in this part of the world, which I think is really exciting. Sorry, that was a little tangent. But so the implications, I think, of this first theme of our findings were that advocates who are wanting to see more FFP commitments might want to point out the opportunity that there is to join this like-minded group of countries, rather than sort of emphasizing it as a point of differentiation. And really also supporting the development of local and regional definitions of FFP, and sort of the continuity with existing practice. And we're going to problematize some of those findings in 1 second. But yeah, so while the growth might sort of seem like the concept is really booming, what we found really in 2024, despite all these declarations, is that the concept of feminist foreign policy is facing a bit of an existential crisis. And so if we look to the next theme, no worries, from declaration to development. So what happens after you make the announcement? What we found back in 2021, we hadn't really seen much policy development. We'd seen lots of announcements and not much else. And now the more recent commitment makers have been much more intentional in laying out a policy development process. And the older committers like France, Canada, again, are really trying to play catch up. We're also sort of starting to see some best practice approaches, particularly around feminist policy development, consultative policy development, what that looks like, and the really important role of civil society in pushing for and then informing policy development processes. Things like needing to consult across all areas of foreign policy, so not just aid and development, but diplomacy, trade, defense policy, which are much harder to crack into. And particularly the importance of including voices of both domestic and international stakeholders. And we sort of saw some tension starting to emerge in our previous research around the different ways that those stakeholders were being consulted, which has really intensified. And there are still some questions about the extent to which that consultation is a tick box, or are governments really willing to pick up on the more transformative recommendations? So some of the implications here are that, we need to work insider and outsider feminists working together to normalize consultation culture across all areas of foreign policy, including in countries where that's not the norm. So we heard from, in the case of France, it's really not the norm to do detailed consultations with civil society on policy development. And this has actually been a hook to sort of get that in place. And then FFP advocates in government and in civil society, especially in the minority world, which, sometimes we call the global north, countries like Australia, even though we're not in the north, which is why minority world works a little better. We need to really reflect on the types of power that we hold. So this sort of insider-outsider interplay, I think, happens in many ways. But in a lot of ways, it's about proximity to power and what we do with that access to power. So I'm going to wrap up there, and we're going to turn to Neha and Daniela to provide some reflections on these first two themes and the kinds of implications they might have.
Hello, can you hear me okay? So first of all, I want to really congratulate you on the report. I thought it was fantastic. I really enjoy reading it. And I was telling you before the panel started that it is one of my favorite feminist foreign policy reports that I've read thus far. And I think it comes at a crucial point. It has been a decade since Sweden adopted the first, or announced, or innovated the term feminist foreign policy. And it is time we start seeing some results, even if that's not the case. But what I really enjoyed from the report, or what I found particularly thought-provoking, was how you really grapple with the nuances, with the contradictions that we are seeing now in feminist foreign policy, and you did not shy away from that. And yeah, it's really great, and I recommend everyone read it. And so just a few comments to start with. I completely agree and see how feminist foreign policy and these announcements are no longer a way of standing out, but more a way of signaling that you're joining a like-minded group. However, something I do want to point out is that not all the countries that have adopted a feminist foreign policy are necessarily alike. They may share some principles. However, there is a lot of diversity and richness in how they approach feminist foreign policy, or their concepts of feminist foreign policy, that I think it's very important to tap into and to really embrace those differences as well. And so thinking about my own country, Mexico adopted a feminist foreign policy in 2019. And one of my many frustrations with Mexico's feminist foreign policy is that it really wasn't innovative, not like the ones that have followed since in the region. So Chile's feminist foreign policy is really interesting, how they embrace the term of economic justice. Also Colombia, how they put forth this term of pacifism. And I think Mexico's feminist foreign policy was, even though it was the first in the global south, majority countries to adopt a feminist foreign policy, it wasn't as innovative, I think. So having said that, I do think that Latin America as a region and all these countries establishing some leadership, or really signaling this like-mindedness, is really interesting because of the legacy of Latin Americans' foreign policy. And so Latin America was the first region to adopt a legally binding treaty at the regional level to criminalize all forms of violence against women. It's also the first region to be declared a nuclear-free zone. That was in 1976 with the Treaty of Tlatelolco. And it's also one of the regions, it's also the region with countries who have signaled most solidarity with Palestine. And I think that is very important, and it's definitely how they're making their mark, how they're showcasing their leadership especially among the feminist foreign policy countries. And something that is also particular to Latin American countries is grassroots feminist movements. We've seen the Green Wave in Latin America really make its mark across policy. And I don't think it's a coincidence that all of these Latin American countries are now picking up on the label feminist foreign policy, giving the very strong presence of feminist advocates and organizations in the region. And so I think having so many Latin American countries now being part of the FFP group or coalition is really an opportunity to exchange knowledge, exchange concepts, exchange forms, conceptions of feminism and feminist foreign policy. And it is a way, I think until now, we mostly recognize the leadership of Sweden, Canada, France in taking charge of feminist foreign policy. And now I think it's a really good time to start looking more towards the global South and looking at their leadership, how they're approaching feminist foreign policy, and really reckon with how feminist foreign policy until now, I hope, has been dominated by white feminism, which I think you acknowledge in the report. And I thought that was really great, how you really grapple with those tensions. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Neha.
Okay, first of all, I would want to congratulate the team on this timely research, which is very important given the current geopolitical context in different parts of the world. And of course, AIIA for launching this report and bringing it out publicly. So the 4 themes that has been illustrated in the report, that is, first of all, getting to declaration, then from declaration to development, and then institutionalizing the declaration, and then moving forward. I personally thought that it is a very structured way of actually understanding more about feminist foreign policy approach, because currently I'm doing a PhD in advancing feminist foreign policy in Nepal, where I'm exploring the opportunities and constraints. So when I'm talking about Nepal, Nepal belongs to a South Asian region. And none of the countries in South Asian region has declared or pledged to adopt a feminist foreign policy. So moving forward with the discussion that Daniela had just brought forward, I would want to talk a little bit about the unique opportunities and where South Asia stands in context to adopting a feminist foreign policy, at least getting to the declaration, let's say. So we can see the early feminist foreign policy adopters like Sweden. They stood out, of course, by declaring policies, the 3R framework based on the reality, that is the rights, representation, and resources based on the reality of women and girls. Bringing that approach, that framework internally within the domestic policy, and also looking outwards on the basis of those framework was an exceptional case. It was pretty innovative looking from a South Asian region, because when we talk about rights, when we talk about representation, when we talk about gender mainstreaming, it's basically confined towards the domestic policies. In South Asian region, we do not think about incorporating those ideas within the foreign policy approaches. So the year 2022, we come to 2022 now. So it was a watershed moment in global politics, where the centrality of geopolitics in the conduct of foreign policy started gaining a lot of debate. Now, when we're talking about geopolitical debate, the first, being an academics, the first thing that comes in my mind is moving to the notion of classical geopolitics, that is states conducting their relation on the basis of the abstract concept of border security. It's about the political map. The debates is all about political map and political mapping. So that's what the case was with Russia's invasion in Ukraine, the current issue of Palestine. So that content, those debates can actually be reflected in context to South Asian region as well. Because when I'm talking about South Asia, there are countries like India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, Bangladesh, where time and again, there's a lot of contestation when it comes to the political mapping part to it. And of course, again, going back globally in context to Sweden, Sweden's application in 2022 to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization itself, as a response to Russia's invasion to Ukraine, was a significant reversal of the country's historical non-alignment policy. So other champions of feminist foreign policy from the minority world, like Germany and France, they have increased their defense budgets and they've accelerated the militarization of their society. And given the geopolitical climate, that's not a surprise. So with contradictions, increase in minority world, in the articulation, implementation, and sustenance of feminist foreign policy, the majority world, that is the global south. And I'm in line with the argument that Danny has just put forward as well. So the global south is reviving the concept of feminist foreign policy. And there's a publication by LSE Ideas, a foreign policy think tank of London School of Economics. And as of 2023, among the 14 countries committed to feminist foreign policy, 7 countries from the majority world have openly designated the foreign policy as being feminist. So they haven't backed off from labeling their foreign policy as a feminist foreign policy. So their adoption is not a wholesale importation from the minority world, and it's more of a thoughtful and a context-specific formulation based on local needs and priorities. And that is what the case is of Colombia as well. And Colombia's feminist foreign policy is highly celebrated in that context. Now, having said this, I would want to come to one of the papers that I find it very interesting as well, and I wanted to share it with the audience here, that is basically about navigating the domestic and international tensions, the white feminism that we just talked about. So there's a common critique of feminist foreign policy globally in the that there could be a tension about importing the feminist foreign policy concept from the Western side of the world to the global South particularly. And when we talk about feminist foreign policy, one of the most important thematic issue is the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. So I came across this paper, and there was an interview conducted, and one of the participants, very interestingly, quote unquote, said that when I go to the rural areas and ask people about 1325, they say, what is that? Is that a taxi number? Even educated people don't know what 1325 is. How can we expect people in the village to know all these numbers and remember them? They don't know what the Security Council is and what UNHCR 1325 is. They may memorize it for once, but they forget about the program. They forget after the program is finished because the Security Council doesn't sound real to them. And I think feminist foreign policy, moving forward from WPS, could be a medium that could localize the voices, the marginal voices, and could bring forward the declaration and development, particularly in context to South Asian region.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely point for Alice to now talk about sort of the institutionalization side of it as well, because that's, yeah, a really important point. Thank you both for that.
Yeah, thank you both. I think you've picked up on some really important themes from the research and sort of how they interact with what's happening in different parts of the world. So the next theme in the research, if you can just click the button, thank you, is on institutionalization. So it's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing to actually get an organization, or in this case, a department, a bureaucracy, using it, living by it, implementing it every day. So in our 2021 research, we identified that government actors were taking some steps to sort of focus on increasing buy-in and ownership of FFP commitments, with the expectation that that sort of greater ownership would lead to greater implementation. And in some cases also there was a sense that that would be supported by accountability from civil society. So this time, a lot of that was actually top-down last time, coming from sort of political, the political will at the top. And what we found this time was that there were really different kinds of strategies being used to build ownership. So there was sort of the top-down stuff, the mandate, training, guidance, incentives. There were also bottom-up strategies, both within departments, so sort of that sense of building ownership, but also the external accountability was a really strong theme. But it really remains an ongoing challenge. And there was also even some ambivalence about the idea of institutionalization, particularly the idea that we want to try and institutionalize FFP to survive changes in governments, which we'll come back to in discussion of kind of future trajectories. But also around the institutionalization of feminism, and can you really take this, radical concept of feminism and institutionalize it in a way that retains its value? And we probably rewrote the discussion section of this part of the report about 10 times because we were really trying to grapple with some of these questions, like, is this a good idea? Have we gone down the wrong path? We talked about, in the report, we talk about policy evaporation, which comes from a researcher in 1977, Sarah Longway, who talks about the way that policy evaporation happens because the political nature of gender equality is sort of taken out of things like gender mainstreaming. So we sort of depoliticize these concepts, which really robs them of their power. So they might become more widely accepted, but we've hollowed them out in that process. And I also came across some really great writing by Kirthi Jayamulkar from the Gender Security Project, which I would really highly recommend if you're interested in FFP. She's got some courses. She does a lot of really excellent writing on decolonizing feminist foreign policy. And she talked about the concept of civilizational feminism and the way that we sort of take these kind of radical concepts and make them civilized by taking away all of their power. And, a lot of that is kind of proximity to whiteness and the structures of power that uphold white supremacy. So just in terms of the final theme around future trajectories, the real kind of theme of every single interview we did was like, wow, this might be the peak for feminist foreign policy. This might be as many as we ever have. Because that risk of conservative governments coming into power, it was on the radar in 2021 in our research, but it was the really strong theme this time around. And, with Sweden stepping back from their commitment, the change of government in the Netherlands, and also Argentina had a fairly short but powerful commitment to feminist foreign policy, which was lost with their change of government. So there's sort of on the one hand, this loss at the political level, but then there's also, as I mentioned, kind of the hollowing out of feminist foreign policy. And a big part of that is the failure of many, not all, but many feminist foreign policy governments to take really transformative actions with those commitments. So, often what governments will talk about when they talk about how proud they are to have a feminist foreign policy really comes down to women in diplomacy, gender mainstreaming, maybe a bit of funding to a few feminist organizations, but not many. It's less than 0.5% of all ODA goes to women's rights organizations, which is pretty shocking. And so, these are all good things, but governments should have been doing them anyway. The hope of feminist foreign policy was that it would inspire really new transformative actions. And I think particularly in the sort of minority world, FFP commitments, which have been around for longer, we haven't seen as much of that as we'd hoped to. And so I think there's a real need for strong accountability for those transformative elements of FFP, but also really consistent and specific demonstration of how and why it is a necessary response to these crises that we're seeing around the world. So many of these crises are multifaceted. They can't be addressed by one country. They require us to engage with structures of power like colonialism and militarism and capitalism. And the failure to address them so far doesn't mean that it's impossible, just means we haven't done it yet. And so I think there's a real need for we sort of talk about quality over quantity, which was a typo we picked up at the last minute. We had those the wrong way around. Importantly, we want quality over quantity of feminist foreign policies. We want really robust commitments, and we want those commitments to drive transformative practice. So I might leave it there and turn back to Neha and Daniela for some reflections.
I'm just going to briefly interrupt because I think we started a few minutes late. So is it okay if we eat into question time to hit? Perfect. Yep. So I'd love to hear your reflections. Thank you.
Well, a quote that I hear often in reference to feminist foreign policy is Audre Lorde: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And it always gives me pause, because when feminist foreign policy is mainly sponsored by states, and the nation state continues to be synonymous with the colonial neoliberal project, then I don't think we're going to get very far. And I think it's really important to remember what both of you mentioned at the beginning, and that is that feminist civil society has been advocating for feminist informed policies for a very long time, for decades and decades, since before Sweden adopted or announced its feminist foreign policy. And so I definitely agree also with the assessment in the report that there is this widening gap between government-sponsored feminist foreign policy and feminist civil society vision for gender justice in foreign policy and elsewhere. So I think it's very important to not lose track of feminist civil society as the main stakeholders, as main leaders, and the ones really creating the content of feminist foreign policy. And I think that brings me back to institutionalization. And the term that I usually use is also NGOization. I really like Sonia Alvarez's reflections on NGOization, especially in feminist spaces, and what happens when feminism becomes institutionalized and robbed of that transformative, more radical potential. And so I think one way to deal with that is for feminist civil society primarily to agree on some non-negotiables. Because there you also mentioned a term which I found really interesting, which is transparent coherence and misalignment. And I think that's great, but I think that there also needs to be a threshold where feminist civil society says, well, that there's just no space for that within a feminist foreign policy, like saying that civilian sites are going to lose their protection status, right? Like that, there's simply no space for that within a feminist foreign policy. And I think feminist advocates and feminist foreign policy advocates have to be very clear about drawing the line there. And I think what is happening in Germany right now is a clear sign of the limits of feminist foreign policy. I'll leave it at that for now. Oh, well, to end on a positive note, I think right now the world is very much in need of unyielding feminist vision. And I think that feminist civil society is able to provide that. And even though we might be in despair right now, Joe Prudella mentioned this the other day in the call, it's a moment to not obey in advance and really stick to our principles and our values. And really, I want to emphasize the word unyielding in our vision for gender justice.
Perfect. Thanks, Danny. Over to you, Neha.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier as well, like feminist foreign policy itself has not been formally adopted by any of the South Asian countries. But gender equality is increasingly being acknowledged in domestic policies. So it's there, legal commitments are there in context to gender equality. So feminist foreign policy could actually be a medium to bring forward gender equality in the foreign policy paradigm now in context to South Asian region. And why is that important is because we can see a lot of backslide and a conservative shift in South Asian region as well. And this has led to concerns about the progress that has been made domestically. For instance, Afghanistan's progress on women's rights and participation in governance has been drastically reversed with the Taliban's return to power. So this highlights the vulnerability of feminist policies in regions experiencing political upheaval or where gender equality is not prioritized at the national level. So there could be a domino effect in the region. Second thing is about the political will, which we discussed earlier as well. So the political will in many South Asian countries to adopt a comprehensive feminist foreign policy is often influenced by conservative leadership, and there is a lack of will to actually adopt a feminist foreign policy. And why is that the case? So again, I'm coming back to the geopolitical priorities that overshadows gender issues. So while I was doing my research, the participants were talking about how gender issues are soft issues. They are secondary issues. The only priority that Nepal needs to think about is balancing the relationship between India and China. So Nepal is situated between India and China, and Nepal has an open border in the eastern, western, and the southern region. So with that, there's a lot of movements among people, and there's a lot of cultural ties between Nepal and India as well. So the open border that stretches in these three regions has a profound impact on the human security of women and girls. So the cross-border relationship has strengthened the cultural and family bonds, but they have also facilitated trafficking, exploitation of women and girls, making them more vulnerable to various forms of violence, abuse, and exploitation. And this is where feminist foreign policy could paint a better picture if institutionalized and implemented appropriately. Also, talking further on the international agendas and the influence of international agendas, gender issues, particularly in context to Nepal's foreign policy, often gain traction only when it is linked to international aid or a global norm. So Nepal's gender initiatives often align with donor priorities, rather than stemming from the systemic reorientation of its foreign policy. So these are various geopolitical challenges, institutional challenges that is visible particularly in context to Nepal. And moving forward, and of course, the suggestions for advocacy in context to South Asia is very much relevant to the thematic issues that has been reflected in the report as well, particularly in context to holding the government officials accountable, building an existing gender commitments, expanding it over to the foreign policy approaches as well, focusing more on regional cooperation, and having an inclusive foreign policy approach. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So I think we are a little bit over time. So did you want to make a couple of concluding statements to tie it up before we go to Q&A, or what do you think? Would you? Q&A, excellent. Okay, sounds good. Thanks, everybody.